Hello, fellow foodies. This is Cassandra Quave, your host for Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. So, as an ethnobotanist, I'm absolutely fascinated with the ways that humans relate to and transform plant ingredients from the natural world. It's an incredible thing to learn how humans have sorted through nearly 400,000 species of plants over centuries and have determined which plants are useful as foods, medicines, tools, and much, much more. And when it comes to food, despite access to what feels like every type of cuisine that we see globally, our modern diets are less varied than ever. Of more than 6,000 species of plants that were once consumed by humans, only 9 remain staples today. And of those, rice, wheat, and corn now make up half of all of our calories. The world is currently at a crisis point with 1 million plant and animal species extinction. But there are those who are fighting to save these species, dedicating their lives to not only capturing this traditional knowledge, but also preserving the species, their ecosystems in which they persist, and their amazing flavors when it comes to foods that could greatly enhance the human diet. My guest today is the award winning journalist, Dan Saladino. He's the author of a really amazing new book called Eating to Extinction: The World's Rarest Foods and Why We Need to Save Them. In writing this book, Dan traveled the world to document these vanishing foods and food cultures and explain why they are essential to our survival. As he journeys from Oaxaca, Mexico to Okinawa, Japan, and even more remote corners of the world, Dan also shares with us the stories of pioneering farmers, scientists, cooks, food producers, and indigenous communities that are preserving food traditions and fighting for their endangered foods. The future of our planet depends on reclaiming genetic biodiversity before it is too late. And as Dan writes in the book's introduction, you can help too by finding the foods that are endangered in your area, whether an apple variety or a local cheese. By eating these, you can help to save them. Such foods represent much more than sustenance. They are history, identity, pleasure, culture, geography, genetics, science, creativity, and craft. And I think that's such a great way to introduce our guest. So thanks so much for coming on the show today, Dan. I loved your book, and I know
Well,
that our audience is going to love meeting you and learning more.
thank you very much, Cassandra. And I've been listening to the previous editions, and I can see how this fits in not only with your work, but the other conversations you've been having in recent episodes.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that our audience is really interested in is really developing a better understanding of how the health of our planet is tied to human health. And I think maybe we could start with a discussion of one of the most shocking numbers that you mention in your book, and that is that out of 6,000 species of plants that were once consumed by humans, we now rely on just nine species. So, how did that happen, and what are the major risks of ant on such a small pool of species?
Mm. There are various timescales I work in with the book, and in some cases I need to go back 3.5 billion years. In some cases, it's 2 million years, and the origins of our humans. 300,000 years, Homo sapiens, and then 10, 12,000 years, the birth of agriculture, really, and how that unfolds. The reason why those timescales are important is because I was interested in how did we end up with these, inheriting these riches of all of this diversity. So I was interested in the origins of these wild grasses that became crops that then were somehow domesticated by the earliest farmers in the Fertile Crescent, or maize in southern Mexico and rice in China. And the idea that as humans spread from those, what Vavilov would call centers of origin or
Mhm.
centers of diversity, how those plants adapted, not only to the environmental conditions, but also the cultural ones as well, and these different preferences that as people moved around the world and they took the seeds with them, how we ended up with this incredible, beautiful diversity. And so, as you know, in the Arctic Circle, deep in the ice is the seed vault on the island of Svalbard, where there are hundreds of thousands of unique samples of wheat and maize and rice. And that collection is the record of the diversity that your ancestors, my ancestors, created over those thousands of years. And so many of these plants were adapted to local conditions and needs. Hence, there was this huge diversity that you mentioned of all these thousands of plants that were domesticated. In a sense, the narrowing of diversity on one level can be seen as a success story. Over the last couple of 100 years, as we've been able to not only industrialize societies more generally with science and technology, we've also done the same with food, and we've produced huge, increasing amounts of calories to the world, and we've done that by focusing on these high yielding and increasingly successfully bred modern varieties. But that's catching up with us now. And so that boom, that post-war boom that we now refer to as the Green Revolution, but also earlier at the beginning of the 20th century with the development of plant breeding and the understanding of genetics, that gave us a toolkit to try and create these huge yields and all of these calories. And it seemed to many to work. And it staved off starvation in some parts of the world. It created an abundance of cheap food. But as we know, there is always a catch. It was too good to be true. And there's been huge cost of that system that is so young and so new and novel in the context of our evolution. It's impacted on our health. And increasingly, we understand the costs to planetary health as well, in terms of the energy required, the water used, the soil being depleted, and also the fact that the uniformity in these crops is going to be a huge challenge to future food security, because there are no monocultures in nature. And so diseases are catching up and overwhelming some of the world's most important crops that are now genetically quite narrow and based on a small number of varieties.
Yeah, that's such a really amazing point. I mean, I think most of our listeners can think back to grade school when we learned about the Irish potato famine, which was a great example of, where you have lack of diversity. We know the crop center of origins of potatoes is in the Andes. But what's amazing is there's huge diversity, especially historically in that region when it comes to different varieties of potatoes. But when I go to the grocery store, I only see a few different, potatoes, and I feel like we're almost given this illusion of diversity in our food access. Can you talk a bit more about that? Like,
and
what's
that's
happening?
that's a really important point, because I think many people listening, watching, will be thinking, well, that's not my experience, in a sense that, and I make this case in the book, that our generation and people alive today can enjoy a huge amount of diversity that perhaps they think their grandparents didn't enjoy. 2 points on that, really. One is that's true. We live in a global economy, and we can move foods around the world. So the risk is it's the same kind of diversity that's spreading around the world wherever you are. So in the same way that languages and fashion and music are spreading, so are the same food types of food, the same seeds, plants, animal breeds. This uniformity is spreading. The second point is, in the book, I'm delving deep into the building blocks of the food system, and so I am interested in the things that don't really become apparent when you're shopping in a supermarket, which is wheat, rice, maize. What's the genetic diversity within that crop? And for that, you really need to look at the history. And so what I do also is tell the origin story of these foods, how they were domesticated, where, how, and how was diversity created over time. And yeah, I think the shrinking of that diversity matters, because in some cases we don't really understand the value of what's being lost. And so I tell the story of a type of maize that's growing in Oaxaca, in Mexico, high up in a remote mountainous area. And it was, botanists encountered this at the end of the 1970s. It took 40 years for them to unpick why was this maize growing in such a difficult area, and the soil wasn't good. Not many nutrients feeding the plant. And also when they encountered this maize, it was 16 feet tall.
Wow.
It was oozing mucus from these aerial roots that were coming out above ground. It turns out that this, it took scientists. It involved new science. Recently,
I think I
science.
remember this paper coming out recently a few years ago. Amazing. I mean, it's
yeah.
yeah.
So because of this success of these high yielding crops that managed to spread around the world and overwhelm these local food systems where there is diversity, we are losing things that we now realize that we will need in the future. And so that maize, for example, could be a way in which in the future, I missed a really crucial point here, that the mucus that was oozing was full of microbes and bacteria that was helping the plant feed itself, through a process of taking nitrogen from the air. And this was, to many botanists, unheard of in maize. So it's groundbreaking, but it was so endangered that only a few villages had clung on to that type of maize. You mentioned the potato, and again in Ireland in the 19th century, they were growing the lumper potato year in, year out in the same soil. And the fungal disease caught up, and obviously we know what happened. 1 million people died, many more had to leave Ireland. The population has never really recovered, which is fascinating. Scientists are still dealing with that disease, and for the solutions, they are now going to the place in which the potato was domesticated. They're looking at the diversity in the Andes for the traits that will give greater resistance, or perhaps potatoes and other tubers that can grow where there is less water, or that there are climatic shocks. So we need to know the story of where those foods come from, because of that diversity that can still exist in those places of origin, because of those traits that have been bred out of these monocultures that we've created. So diversity increasingly matters for our food future.
That's such a great point. I mean, I see this all the time on the small scale in traditional villages where farmers don't grow just one variety of a crop. They grow multiple varieties. And some of those varieties, by the way, have some unpleasant characteristics. I'm thinking one example of another tuber, like in the Amazon, is bitter cassava, which is Manihot esculenta. Bitter manioc or bitter cassava has higher levels of hydrogen cyanide, which you're like, why would you grow food with cyanide? Well, it better withstands some of these pests, and you can basically process the food to remove the cyanide. But there are even other tubers I think really have not made it mainstream, and one in particular that I enjoyed reading about was oca. So what can you tell us about oca? And that's spelled OCA for all the listeners. Yeah.
I would love to talk about oca, or oca, as I sometimes call it as well. Can I just put a word in for the cassava story?
Oh yes, please. Sorry, I jumped ahead.
Simply because I'm not in the book just talking about the importance of genetic diversity. I'm also telling the story of these incredible, ingenious ways humans have survived around the world.
Yes.
And the skills and the knowledge that took thousands of years and many generations to develop. and that process that you mentioned of making something that is potentially toxic safe, and using processes such as fermentation to do that, completely mind-blowing, of
Mind blowing,
how
absolutely.
that
Yeah.
happened. And we are we are at risk not only of losing the genetic material, but also the knowledge and the skills and the cultures that enabled that to happen. The same is true of the oca as well. So it's a tuber that was domesticated a bit further north in the Andes than the potato. Smaller, it looks like a kind of bullet-sized, and they can be purple and yellow. And again, there's this challenge of bitterness in these in the oca, which again gives it a defense mechanism. And what I saw when I travelled through the Andes was this process in which they took these small tubers and they took it through a process of soaking it in water in these pools that they'd created beside a river, and they would soak there for a month or perhaps 6 weeks. They would then take the oca in sackfuls, which now had a lot of the bitterness leached out of it, and they would take it to a high altitude and they would spread it out, and then in the process of the sun coming up and then in the evening it cools down, it took the water out of the tuber and created these dry, parched tubers, which were then taken back to the village and then ground down and then turned into these cakes effectively that could be stored for months, if not years. A huge important source of carbohydrate and other nutrients as well, and also delicious once that process had happened. And there was a botanist who from the States who's been traveling through the Andes, who I had a conversation with, because I mean the oca is a lot less understood than the potato. It's just one of those. It's almost like an orphan crop, in a way. And so Eve Emschwiller, who
Yes.
features in the book, wonderful woman who's travelled to through Bolivia and Peru, saving diversity, because she told me the story of having conversations with truck drivers who are arriving in the remote villages, encouraging, with all good intention, encouraging farmers to start growing a very popular potato for people in the cities. And so what was happening is this huge diversity was disappearing in these Andean villages, and they were being replaced by a crop that they needed to have chemical inputs to grow. And so, yeah, Eve was there documenting and doing what she could with the various governments to try and save diversity.
That's amazing. Yeah, Eve's also a fellow ethnobotanist and doing amazing work. I need to get her on the show, actually. This has got me thinking about it'd be great to have a whole episode on oca. It is an interesting crop, and it's again that question of like, what makes a crop successful of making that leap into global trade, right? And then going back to cassava, I mean, this is one of the most popular, crops throughout the tropics, across the Americas and into Africa, and yet you don't really see it as much in trade. I mean, you see a little bit in circulation in stores in the US. I don't know if it's really sold in the UK or Europe, but yeah, I don't know if
Only
in
in
your
small
work.
amounts,
Yeah.
and mostly where there are communities who have a relationship with that food. But
Yeah.
there are many neglected crops that have huge potential, which is why I ended up speaking to, in the case of the UK, people at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, and the teams of botanists there, and the people who really are scouring the world looking for these neglected or forgotten crops, and traveling through parts of Africa and Asia and seeing what they can do to try and make them more economically viable, and also trying to inform people that actually there are different ways of processing them and and cooking them. There there is a story that's missing from the book that I took out because it was just getting too big and there were too many stories on it, and I think my editor felt that the reader was going to be overwhelmed. But it's a really important story, and perhaps I'm going to be, I'll save it for book 2. But it's the story of millets in India, and
Yes.
a huge, historically a really important crop. And I think various studies have been done that if you actually replaced a lot of the wheat and rice in India, then it would be win-win-win in terms of nutrition, in terms of water, in terms of soil health. But it fell out of favor, and a lot of this is to do with colonialism when the British arrived, and they introduced a lot of wheat varieties that they had been researching. So now millets are very difficult to process, or more difficult to process than a lot of other crops. But the technology now exists for that to be less arduous and to be speeded up. So I think it's in the 21st century we can apply science and technology to these forgotten crops, and perhaps there is a new era in which they can be foods again for many millions, if not billions, of people.
That's great. Well, one thing I also appreciate in your book, I mean, I could talk all day, every day about plants, but I also appreciate your addressing the subject of meat and some of these livestock. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your chapter on bison and kind of.
Yeah, because what I try and do in the meat section is a couple of things. One is to say that the process that we've just been talking about, that homogenization of food around the world and the uniformity, genetic uniformity of plants, exactly the same thing has happened with livestock as well, which is why 95% of the dairy herd in the States is one breed of cow, the Holstein.
Wow.
And again, so we've seen that decline in genetic diversity. But at the same time, I also wanted to tell stories that reminded us of what our relationship over, again, millennia has been with animals. And so I tell the story of the chicken, of pig, of the way in which people in very difficult, cold, harsh parts of Northern Europe fermented sheep meat. But yeah, in that chapter, I also want to tell the story of how that relationship really saw a complete absence of reverence and respect for animals. And I think the bison is such a powerful story of how in such a short period of time, from the beginning of the 19th towards the end of the 19th century, that various pressures were bearing down on this animal, and also it tells us that process of humans dominating nature, of greed, of industrial processes by which it became possible through rail networks and the technology of the gun and horse as well, to slaughter millions and millions of bison that had been roaming through across the Central Plains for hundreds of thousands of years. And in a sense, by the beginning of the 20th century, it also tells the story of the beginnings of the conservation movement of a small group of people who understood what was happening, to gather together the relatively tiny number of bison that had survived and have these conservation herds. The problem was, because they felt that they needed a quick fix, there was a lot of breeding with cattle. And so what's happening now in the recovery of the bison is that through DNA testing, increasingly bison breeders are now able to try and get us back to a position where we have pure bison herds. And so I went to Zapata Ranch in southwestern Colorado and saw some of that process happening. And again, it's just such a moving, powerful story of what we are capable of, in terms of the destruction of nature, but also the fact that there are so many amazing people who are doing this work to bring these endangered crops and animals back.
Yeah, this reminds me of another author I interviewed. I think it was 2 seasons ago. I don't know if you're familiar with, Gina Ray LaCerva's book, Feasting Wild, but it
Yeah.
was just shocking to me the level of destruction that had been wreaked upon not only, wildlife, I mean, and just thinking about in the Americas, the birds that were slaughtered, and also sea turtles in the Caribbean that were, a big part of the transatlantic slave trade, and how all this kind of came together. And as a result, I mean, we've never really recovered those
Mm.
populations of those wild animals, and there are some important lessons there, you
And
know.
also, yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also something really deep about the relationship bec- between us, these animals, and an ecosystem. Because the
Mhm.
bison, we think of the bison roaming, and and they were hunted, and they were a source of food, and obviously their skins were useful as well. I mean, every part of the bison was valuable to the Native American people
Mhm.
for thousands of years. Um, but they were also animals that were part of a system in which
Yeah.
they, from fertilizer to the spreading of seeds, birds were dependent on them, other animals were dependent. They were part of an entire complex ecosystem. Take out the bison, and then so much else of that system fails. But also, there's that part of that system were human beings. So when
Yeah.
I spoke to one of the breeders who was reintroducing bison to the Great Plains, she described this most moving scene in which people had gathered to see her free the bison that she had bred, these bison babies that she'd been looking after. And there was a ceremony of some of the tribes close to where she was
Mhm.
working who were there, who had an extremely intimate and close relationship with the bison still, and they were beating drums and singing a ceremonial song. And she knew the way in which these bison behaved, and she was surprised to see that when the song and the drum beat started, everything fell silent, including the bison. It was
Wow.
almost as if there was some connection being made between the humans and the bison that we could never possibly explain. But equally moving is when the bison started to leave their the confines, that hundreds of people had gathered to watch this happening. And the sight of these bison leaving and then entering this landscape made people break down and cry.
Mm.
And again, there's just something extremely deep about that relationship between us, nature, and these animals. And it doesn't take much to remind us that that was the case.
Yeah. Now you put it so eloquently. I mean, I think too often today we see humans apart from nature instead of recognizing our role in nature. And as you said, there have been systems of traditional land management that have gone on for millennia successfully, sustainably, that had integration of these plants and different livestock that was all part of a integrated system
Mm.
that provided food.
Yeah, I mean, I tell the story in a wild section. I mean, the wild section, just to explain that
Mhm.
there are 10 parts in the book, and it goes from wild to cereals, to fruit, to animals, as you say, and food from the sea. That sequence at the beginning of the book, from wild to cereals, it also has the chronology of us being hunter gatherers into
Mhm.
farmers. And so the book starts with the Hadza hunter gatherers in Tanzania, in Eastern Africa, and I tell the story of their relationship with honey, and also a bird that guides them to the honey as well, the honey guide
I love
bird,
that.
indicator. And again, that's the story of not only just biodiversity being lost and their land being lost, but also knowledge, skills that could have been developing for 700,000 years. We think that relationship between humans being whistled to a bird for the bird to then show them where the honey is could date back to the origins of humans using fire. Again, just another mind-blowing story. But the second story is from Australia, and you mention about indigenous knowledge and land management.
Mhm.
Well, there I tell the story of this a very small root called a yam daisy or murnong, very sweet, almost coconut flavored root. And this was the go to food for many
Mm.
people in southern Australia, again, before the colonists, the British, arrived. And what happened when the British arrived is that the sheep and the cattle that they introduced in vast numbers just tore through the landscape and
Wow.
completely changed that landscape and depleted this food resource for the
Mm.
Aboriginal people. But Murnong was almost semi-domesticated because the Aboriginal people were using fire to manage the land, to
Mhm.
clear tracks of some of the other plants, to make space and to provide sunlight for the Murnong as well. And when the I don't know if you, just a few years back, when Australia was really hit hard by these awful fires,
Yeah.
um, some of the areas where the Aboriginal people were still practicing fire management, they were not as badly affected because they'd created these breaks in the land where the fire couldn't spread. And again, one of the arguments in the book is that we cannot ignore this knowledge and these resources that took thousands and thousands of years to create, and then dismiss them, and in some
Yeah.
cases dismiss them as being primitive. um, and and we are learning that there is so much wisdom, and but it shouldn't be surprising because it kept humans alive for so long.
Yeah.
We're the ones who are in a precarious situation now.
Yeah. Oh, that yeah. I mean, that's been shown. I mean, also here in the States, I mean, there's some amazing studies looking at f traditional fire management practices with landscapes and how, when you have a buildup of, foliage and dead material over time,
Mm,
that's when you get the huge wildfires that are really damaging to cities. Yeah, this is a really important aspect of the traditional land management. It's not it's all very integrated. You have the
mm,
genetic material, the biodiversity of the genetic material is important. The human knowledge of how to transform that material or that ingredient into a foodstuff that could last or could promote health. And then, how do you manage this whole ecosystem? I mean, it's
mm.
incredibly complex and definitely not primitive on any scale. I mean, this is complex ecology. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think, and at the same time, I can understand why it was that in particularly in the 19th and the 20th century, with these inventions and discoveries and developments, that people felt they'd found the answer. That
Mhm.
actually some of these technologies that could override natural systems were a fix. But nature is catching up with us, and we now understand that many of the solutions we found were quite, well, not quite, but extremely reductionist,
Mhm.
and that nature will always catch up because it is, as you say, so complex and interconnected. And so for us to then create silos in which we are selecting um, a very small, narrow genetic pool, and then using these inputs to override all of those other natural systems, so lack of nutrients or lack of water, or
Mhm.
um, yeah, I mean, we are run, as I say in the book, we are farming on borrowed time now in many cases.
Yeah.
uh,
Well, I think some of the plants that all of our listeners know and love and probably consume on a daily basis are at risk. I mean, I don't know. I probably need to do a show on becoming banana apocalypse of, with this,
mm,
this again, another fungal disease because we clonally propagate bananas across the globe. Coffee
mm,
is also at risk. And I know you have a chapter looking into coffee and its origins. I mean, it's amazing the fact that we do have so little genetic diversity when it comes to coffee and also for chocolate.
mm.
Um, yeah,
Yeah,
I wonder,
yeah.
can you tell us a little bit about your section on stimulants? Because I mean, these are some of our most important
Mm.
kind of, foodstuffs, coffee, tea, chocolate, all these sources of, I'll get geeky here with my pharmacology of those, xanthine alkaloids that stimulate the brain and make us very happy.
Mm.
But what's going on with those and what did you learn in your investigation on these stimulants?
Yeah, well, I'm a huge, huge coffee fan for
Mhm.
personal reasons. So in terms of my consumption, and how lucky we are to have that crop. But yeah, again, like so many of the other foods, I wanted to go to the origins, And so there are some great experts in the UK based, as I mentioned before, at Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. One of them is called Aaron Davies. He travels through parts of Ethiopia, which is considered to be the center of origin for Arabica, so the most important coffee crop globally. And this the story of how coffee leaves its center of origin in these wild coffee forests, effectively, where people have lived alongside coffee plants for thousands of years, end up in Yemen, which is just over a stretch of water to the east of Ethiopia, and then in the 17th century, a small number of plants start to escape with Europeans and then are taken around the world, creating the coffee types that we have today. And so that explains this narrow genetic base that is around the coffee belt of the equator. And Aaron Davis has also done work looking at what will be the impact of climate change on that very small genetic pool. And Arabica is quite a delicate plant. And so that's one of the reasons why it's at risk, and it might not have the genetic, all of the traits that exist in the wild that have been that are absent from that small selection that was spread around the world. That creates a vulnerable crop. But also, I think back in 2014, in parts of the Americas, it was hit again by one of these fungal diseases. La Roya, the farmers called it, or rust. Devastating disease, really hit yields hard. And again, showing the impact not only of climate change, so the climatic conditions were right for that disease to spread, but also there wasn't much resistance in the crop, and also the way in which they are planted quite close together as well. So again, it's just, as you mentioned, the banana as well. All of these solutions that we came up with have created coffee that could be sold around the world, and you can have a cup of coffee for a couple of dollars or a couple of pounds. And the banana, amazingly, is one of the cheapest things in the supermarket. A fruit from a tropical country. But all of this is being done through the success of these monocultures, effectively. Climate change, and then the impact on farming communities, and then we see communities devastated and hit hard by the consequences of these systems, and then we see migration. Unsurprisingly, that they are forced to leave their homes in search of work and effectively survival. So everything is connected.
Yeah. Wow. Well, one of the places that you talk about in the book, which is, again, one of those very remote and kind of fragile ecosystems, is also a place I just love. I think it's chapter 26 on the Accursed Mountains. So this is known, and I'm probably going to butcher the name in Albanian, but Bejete Nemuna there's actually a large national park. And I was just there in 2019 on the Kosovar side of this region. And I mean, gorgeous mountains, very, very rugged, very difficult to access. Some of the roads are kind of more of like a dirt path than really a road, but just, I mean, amazing streams, just crystal clear streams, and the food is to die for. Now, this is in the section on cheese, and I think I may have eaten the cheese that you talk about, this kind of very salty cheese in this region. What can you share with us about this? Because that also comes back to this idea of fermentation, of the microbiome, and how people use microbes from their environment to transform foods.
Well, the cheese section is one of my favorites, and that particular story means a lot to me because I was told by a chef in Albania that diplomats, when they're posted to Albania, they cry twice. The first time they cry because they say, well, why have I been posted to Albania, this remote, obscure country very few people have heard of, and it had this troubled past of communist rule that closed it off for many, many decades. So they cry once when they arrive, but they cry the second time when they leave, because it's such a beautiful country and
It
culture.
is.
And I cried when I left, because I had it was such an intense
Mhm.
visit that I had, traveling around with somebody who was trying to save these endangered food cultures that had been
Mm.
lost pretty much through communism, through the communist era. And so I ended up going to the far north, into the Accursed mountains. And for me, what it represented was this idea of, well, wheat and barley and maize and rice took humans only so far in terms of
Mhm.
settling and surviving. And then other humans figured out that this special relationship with cows, sheep, goats, meant that although you couldn't grow the crops, the animals could eat the pasture, produce milk, and then
Mhm.
take this energy from the sun, transformed into pasture, combine it with microbes, bacteria, and produce the most delicious food we know, cheese, which could be stored. It's high energy. And what I found in northern Albania was almost, that's the kind of the pure example of how it was, how people in really harsh, high altitude areas where very little would grow could survive,
Mhm.
because of, again, sun into pasture, as energy into the to the animals, who could then process that for us to consume as milk and cheese. And um, you will know a lot more about the biodiversity of the area, but I was told by the people who are studying this in terms of a cheese story, that the
Mhm.
pasture was,
Oh,
it hadn't
yeah.
seen anything like it in terms of the numbers of plants and herbs, and that was then creating this delicious milk, rich in
Mhm.
microbes. So you didn't need a starter culture to make the cheese. It was so alive in a
Yeah.
safe, healthy way.
It's amazing. Like you say, like there's an incredible level of endemism in this region, just because of the elevation gradients. You have different species of plants growing at different elevations.
Mm,
I found what was really fascinating in our studies with different communities, and what else is kind of interesting too, just to note for the listeners, is that in a very small area, you have very different cultures that speak completely distinct languages,
mm,
and so you can have communities that live in similar ecosystems, but who engage with those ecosystems in very different ways. And
mm.
one of the things that fascinated me was also the use of there are certain wild plants that are not edible, but they will harvest to use as kind of a way to kickstart certain cultures of yogurts and cheeses. And I don't. Did you try Kos while you were there as well? This very acidic yogurt drink. It kind of,
I I did,
yeah,
yeah. I think I had that for a breakfast, one of the
yeah.
breakfasts, which again was just
It's
was a
amazing.
bounty, really. Yeah, yeah. And
It'll
also,
definitely replenish your gut microflora if you
yeah,
ever
yeah.
like you get rid of any kind of probiotic pills. This stuff
Mm.
is the real deal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Maybe not have the hard spirits as well for breakfast as well. Which
The rakia.
sometimes that was on offer as well. But
Yeah.
I think what I also loved about this story was, I mentioned that era of communism when
Mhm.
so much was lost, and actually people went, towards the end of that process as well, serious hunger, um,
Mm.
and this relationship between people who understood something that had great value, was still tucked away in these remote villages. Not only was it important to save, because it was a wonderful food, delicious, really important history, they also understood that to keep these villages alive and to give the people there an income, because that was
Mhm.
a serious problem, which is
Oh,
why I
yeah.
think so many people, so much rural depopulation in that part of the world. And so they understood that if they could bring the cheese back, and then if chefs in the big towns and cities, could put it on their menus and tell the story, there was a whole economy that could be created. And so I saw wonderful things. So it was such a bizarre country under communism in terms of the architecture
Mhm.
that existed, because as you travel around, you see these concrete bunkers, and it was almost as
Yes.
if this was a nation on, almost kind of ready to disappear into bunkers, and So everywhere you look were these bunkers or places where people could act as snipers. I met somebody who was using one of those as a cheese cave to look to look after. So
But it works well.
this symbolism really of this awful past that they'd experienced, but also this revival of cultures that had endured through that whole period in those remote mountain villages.
Amazing. Well, I can't recommend your book enough to all of the listeners. Definitely check out Eating to Extinction by Dan Saladino. And I have one last question to ask you, and I'm sure this is going to be on everyone's mind that's listening is, you've traveled to such amazing places and I'm sure experienced such amazing foods. And I know it's hard to say what's your absolute favorite, but maybe you can offer us a couple examples of some of your most interesting food experiences that you've encountered during your travels.
Well, I think one, because it just filled me full of awe because of the location, is going back to that Hadza story, because there I was in a part of Africa with so many important archaeological finds that revealed our history as humans, as Homo sapiens, and to be eating a food that probably gave them energy from these baobab trees, located with the assistance of a bird that had a conversation with the hunters. That is an extremely special experience I will never forget. But also there is the story of an orange in Sicily that has become endangered because there is now these monocultures that exist in other parts of the world. And so on the island of Sicily, it became economically tough for farmers to carry on growing. And I was meeting farmers who were telling me it was their last harvest for this fruit that had been on the island for 1,000 years. That means a lot to me because my name originates from the island of Sicily. My father is from Sicily. As a child, I used to travel over to Sicily for some holidays to stay with my nonna. So I think the Hadza for a mind-blowing, experience of global food history and us. Sicily and the orange for extremely personal reasons of memories of walking through citrus groves as a child. And that was my first experience of being on a farm.
That's amazing. What a life and what an adventure around these foods. Well, thank you so much. And Dan, tell us, when is your book going to be out and where can listeners find out more about this amazing work that you're doing?
Well, the book is being published on February the 1st by FSG. And in terms of the other work that I do, my radio program it's called The Food Program on BBC Radio 4. It's been running now for more than 40 years. It was established in 1979 by a pioneering journalist who understood a lot of the issues that we've been talking about, and he understood that by the end of the 1970s, much of Britain's traditional foods were disappearing, and so he wanted a program that could tell that story, and that's the program I work on today. So I'm carrying on that legacy as well.
That's great. Well, lots of great resources to turn to. Thanks again, Dan.
Thanks so much, Cassandra. It's a great program, so I'm really, really honored to be on it. Thank you.
Thanks. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. You can find this and all of our other shows at foodiepharmacology.com. You can also catch the video version of this episode on the Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel. I want to thank our producers, to Christine Roth and Rob Cohen, for bringing us forward into season 4, and I'm looking forward to many seasons in the future. Thanks so much for tuning in today, and I'll see you next time.